So good morning everyone. My name is Lynn Lavery. I'm the Director of Academic Consulting and I'm presenting this morning's webinar on tips and tricks for literature reviews. Just a note before I get started on my slides, there's a lot of content in today's webinar and I will be touching on some of the topics quite quickly because I want to get through as many tips as I possibly can for you. If you find yourself at any stage wishing there was a pause or a rewind button, I can't offer you that in the live session, but I am recording the webinar, and assuming that everything goes to plan, you should receive a copy of that recording later today. So that means you'll be able to review any of the material that you would like to. So my suggestion is to sit back and relax during the webinar, take a few notes as we go through. If you do find the pace a little bit on the fast side, keep in mind that you'll be able to revisit the content later with the recording. I wanted to start, though, by thinking about what a literature review actually is. And I thought the definition on my slide there was a nice, concise one from a very useful book that I've come across on literature reviews. I'll be providing the reference for that book later on this morning. So the definition is a literature review is a written document that presents a logically argued case founded on a comprehensive understanding of the current state of knowledge about a topic of study. So in other words, a literature review places your research question in context. It provides the argument as to why you should be looking at a particular topic, either because it fills a gap in the current literature or because it builds on the body of knowledge in some other way. In terms of some other purposes for writing lit reviews, one potential purpose is to identify possible conflicts across contradictory studies. So that's something that you may well end up addressing in your review, in terms of looking at where other researchers have perhaps not agreed with each other and why that might be. It's also a way to identify what's been covered by previous scholars, which will essentially stop you from duplicating their efforts. There's nothing worse than reinventing the wheel, so writing a literature review is a way to ensure that you're not doing that. Lastly, I think the final purpose for writing a lit review would be that it shows you're capable of writing a scholarly piece of work. So they're all very good reasons for writing a lit review, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the process is an easy one. So I'm very much hoping today's tips and tricks will help you out with that process. Now, having said that it can be a challenging process, I'd be quite keen to hear from those of you attending this morning what sort of challenges you may have experienced or are experiencing in relation to a lit review. So I'm going to very quickly launch a poll on the screen. Just like you to pop in, if you had to pick one of these, what would you find most challenging? Now, it might be that you have something different that you're finding challenging, and if that's the case, you're welcome to pop that through the question panel to me. But otherwise, take your pick. We've got everything from narrowing down the topic, finding the articles, managing, processing the literature, critiquing, and lastly, doing the actual writing. So just give you a few moments to get your responses in for that. In case you're curious as to who is attending the session, we have either academic staff or postgraduate students from almost every New Zealand university registered for today, which is very exciting. We did have 43 people registered all up. It looks like we've only got about half of that online at the moment, but this time of year people often do join us late. And I suspect all of you are probably at very different stages of the research process looking at the results that have come in so far. We've got 9/10 of you roughly have voted, so I think what I might do is just close that and share it with you all, just so that you can get a feel for what other people are having issues with. Slightly surprised that no one voted for finding the articles, but these days with technology, that's probably not necessarily so surprising. And it looks like managing and processing the literature and critiquing are the areas that the bulk of you are having issues with. So regardless of what you chose on that poll, these are the 5 aspects of a literature review that I'm going to be covering as part of today's webinar. So in terms of what I'll be going through, when I think about the literature review process, I think there are 5 main stages, and I've called those identify, find, manage, critique, and write. So as I've just said, that's pretty much how I'm going to be breaking down today's presentation. I'll be giving you some tips and tricks for each of those 5 stages. Just to start out though by briefly introducing what each step involves. The first is identify, which is where you are working within your general topic to define your research question or questions and what the parameters around your review are. Once you've done that, you obviously need to find the relevant literature, assess its appropriateness, and decide whether or not it has a place in your review. Regardless of whether or not you're going to include it or exclude it, the ones that you decide to include do need to be managed somehow. So the manage stage, number 3 there, involves staying on top of most likely the numerous references that you've gathered, organising them in a sensible way so that you can easily retrieve them, and also processing them. So in other words, reading them and making meaningful notes that will hopefully be helpful to you when you refer back to them later. As part of that managing process, you'll also hopefully be critiquing. And from that poll, it looks like almost half of you had issues with that stage. Really important to keep in mind that a literature review isn't just a summary of what other people have found. You actually need to compare studies, you critique them in terms of their methodology, and you're looking at what they have added to the body of knowledge. So it's not just a case of saying author A found XYZ. You're actually being critical about what they found, how they interpreted the data, and how they designed their study. Once you've made your way through those first 4 stages, then comes the part of writing up. So in other words, presenting the findings from your literature review in a coherent, very well-structured, logical way that will lead up to the presentation of your research questions. Now, I'm sure it all sounds very nice and concise and succinct when I put it like that, but as many of you, I suspect, know, it can be a very time-consuming process. Hopefully the tips today will help speed things up for you. So let's start out with the first step, which is identify. So in the beginning, what are you going to be doing? Obviously, having a very clear research question or research questions is crucial. And you might not start out the literature review process with a very specific question. It might just be a broad topic area that you have. But hopefully in the early stages of reviewing the literature, that research question will become very clear and specific. As part of developing the question, you also need to decide on the parameters of your literature review. So for example, are you only interested in articles and research from a certain time period? Or maybe you're only interested in research from a particular country, or research that uses a particular theory within your broader topic. So those parameters are really, really important because they allow you to identify terms for keyword searching, which is the third point that I have here. Now, as part of developing your research question and deciding on parameters, you'll also be defining the scope of your research question. And I've got a suggested way of doing that on my slide because I know this is a step that a number of people struggle with. So my suggestion is that you look at your scope in terms of who, what, and how. Now, that strategy isn't going to suit every research question. It is going to depend on what you're investigating, but it's a nice way to try and get yourself just a little bit more specific about the question that you're asking. So just to explain what I mean by those three terms, the who refers to who the research question is about. The what refers to what the researcher needs to find out in order to answer the research question. And the how is exactly how the study will impact on the who. So let's give you an example of that. Let's say you have got a topic where you're interested in doing some research on underage drinking. Now, that's a really wide topic. You'll need to narrow that down in order to conduct your lit review in a sensible way. So if we take that who, what, and how example, we can start to turn it into what I have on my slide. So going from a really broad area of underage drinking to I'm going to do some research on the economic and social implications of school-age drinking. So you can see how we've gone from a very broad sort of general topic into a much more specific question that could actually be answerable. Still quite a challenging topic to cover, but it's a lot more specific. So narrowing down a general topic like that will also help you be a little bit clearer about how you might go about searching for relevant literature. So that brings me to the next stage of the process. I do feel like I've sort of skimmed over that identify section a little bit. It's not something that happens very quickly. It requires an awful lot of thinking and reading, but I suspect that a number of you attending today were probably past that initial stage of the process, so I was keen to move through to some of the later stages to spend more time on those. For those of you attending today who are postgraduate students, just keep in mind that that identify stage is best done in consultation with your supervisor, who will be able to help you with narrowing down the scope of your question. But in terms of the find stage, I've just got the one slide for this, and as I said before, it was very interesting that no one chose this. I suspect this is possibly a stage that you don't necessarily find easy, but it was maybe not the most challenging one of those 5. I think the best advice I can give you in terms of the best way to access relevant literature is to make the most of the library support that your institution offers. Librarians are absolute gold in terms of their knowledge base. We all think we know how to search library databases, but they're actually developing and changing all of the time, and there are new things you can learn at any stage of the process. So I know it takes a little bit of time to get into the library or do a tutorial online to learn about best practice with library resources, but I do think that in the long run, it will actually save you an incredible amount of work. When I was a postgraduate student, my subject librarian saved me months worth of work in terms of teaching me the best way to approach my searching. And I think even more importantly, I actually had confidence that I found all of the articles relevant to my topic. There's nothing more embarrassing than putting together a lit review and then finding out that you've missed a key piece of research. In terms of other tips I have for accessing literature, footnote chasing can be really useful. And by that I mean when you come across a really excellent study that you're very impressed by, take the time to look at the reference list for that study. Go through, have a look at the types of journals that they're citing, the authors that they're talking about, and follow up on some of the ones that look interesting. You'll often find that that technique can help you find references that you might have missed via the library databases, and it can also give you ideas for new keywords that you can search for. So it's a little bit time consuming, but you may well find that it's worth it in the long run. Now, for any academic piece of work at the postgraduate level or beyond, you should only be using primary sources. So if Smith cites Jones in an article that you've read, you do have to go and find the original Jones article. You can't rely on what Smith said about Jones's study. There are very rare occasions where it's not possible to locate an original source, and in that scenario, using the as cited in phrase is fine, but otherwise you always have to go back to the primary source to check that what they've said is actually accurate. Always be as up-to-date as possible. If you have learned how to maximize library resources, you will hopefully have learned things like setting alerts on databases so that you'll be notified as soon as something new comes out. For those of you submitting a thesis at some point in the future, it's also always a good idea just before you complete your final draft. Have a quick look in the journals or on the databases. Try and grab some very recent articles to include. Ideally, you want some that have been published in the current year you're submitting. If you've got a January or February deadline, that could be a little bit tricky, but otherwise try and get at least a few very recent items. I also think it's really important to assess the quality of the literature that you locate. Not all research projects are created equal, so it's really important to take a look at that. A few things to consider when you're thinking about the quality of research are things like the study design. Is the study design a good match to the research question, for example? Things like validity and reliability would also be important to consider. And they may talk about that in the research article itself. Otherwise, if they don't, hopefully you have the skills to assess that yourself. Other things to think about when you're assessing the quality of an article is whether or not there's a clear account of the methods used, and if the data they've presented supports the conclusions that the researchers have made. You should also check to see if the data analysis method is appropriate and whether or not they've explained it well. Now, when I'm assessing the quality of literature, I like to actually have a checklist for myself of all the things that I'm interested in looking at, and I make a note as well of the overall quality of each article. Now, I make a record of that in my reference management software as a keyword, and I'll be talking about reference management software later on in the webinar. Now, my last point about the find stage is that it's really important to keep in mind you don't have to read everything. And I know that might be a little bit startling to hear for some of you, but I do want to reassure you that you don't need to read everything. It will actually be impossible to do so. You will come across, I'm sure, some really fascinating, interesting research studies as you are going through this find process. And the danger is that you can very easily get sent off on sidetracks that aren't relevant to your research question. So remember what I've just said, you simply can't read everything. I had a little strategy for myself when I was doing my PhD. I had a folder on my desktop that I called Read If Time. So the idea was if I came across a really interesting article that I wanted to read, but it actually wasn't relevant to my research question, I would save it in my Read If Time folder. And my plan was, if I had time before I submitted my PhD, I would take a look at that folder to see if I wanted to include any of the articles. Now, I finished my PhD back in 2008, and I have yet to actually look at anything in that folder at all. So I think that's probably an indication that the references I thought were absolutely fascinating and terribly important at the time really weren't all that relevant to what I was investigating. And I found that was a really useful strategy for me, just to keep me moving forward with the literature. Moving on through to the manage stage now, step 3, which I want to spend a little bit more time on than the other sections, because I think one of the challenges of a literature review is managing the sheer volume of information that ends up getting stored on your computer and in other places. Now, the 6 Steps to Success book that I've referenced at the end of my slides has a really nice analogy around how you manage the process of a literature review. They talk about the literature review journey, and they liken it to going on an actual journey. Now, if any of us were travelling to a foreign country for the first time, we would probably be very organised about it. We'd pack for the conditions, make sure we had the appropriate passports and visas, check to see if there are any medications or vaccinations that are needed. And it seems natural that if we were travelling to an unknown country, we would go through those steps to make sure that we dealt with the process as best as we possibly could. But we don't put that same thought into a lit review. Time pressures, other resource restraints usually means we jump straight in, we frantically read, and we hope that something will magically output itself at the other end. And I think just taking a step back at the initial stages and thinking about the strategies that you will use to manage the process is a really useful thing to do. So before you jump straight into it, think about the range of tools that are available. Think about how you're going to take notes from the articles that you read, and how you're going to do even simple things like storing the PDFs that you download from databases. My other comment about this manage stage is it's probably a good idea to pick a system and stick to it throughout. If you put the thought into it ahead of time, there will be much less need to constantly change systems throughout. And that's a mistake that I see lots of novice researchers make, or even more experienced academics actually. They pick a system, they start to input information into it, and then they decide it's not working for them. So they move to something else, and by the time they actually come to write their lit review, they have information spread across 5 different systems, and they're unable to retrieve what they need from any of them. Now, I'm not suggesting that if you've picked a system and it's not working for you, that you shouldn't change, but do be wary of chopping and changing throughout the process. Try and pick something that will work for you and stick with it throughout. Those of you that follow us on Facebook might have noticed that we posted about this particular issue of constantly switching between systems earlier on this week. Now, in terms of some tips for managing the process, there is obviously specific information you should be keeping on each individual reference, but in terms of overall records, here are some things that I think it would be worth you keeping records of. So a list of the keywords you've searched is incredibly valuable. That way you can rerun searches later if you need to, and it also means you've got a little bit of an audit trail of the process that you've used. Obviously, key sources consulted and any internet sites as well should be recorded, as well as any electronic databases that you've searched. Now, generic notes are very useful. Things like articles you still need to access from the library, authors you might want to chase up for further information, references that you maybe want to have a second read of because you're not quite sure you understood them first time round. So with all of those things, it's just a matter of keeping some sort of record, possibly in a research journal that you might have, or otherwise some sort of electronic note-taking system that you might be using. Now, along with that paper trail, I can't emphasize enough how important it is that you have all of the information for each reference. There is nothing worse than generating the final reference list and finding out that information is missing, or even worse, you've chosen to include a quote from an author and you have no record of the page number. In fact, that's the type of work we do a lot of here at Academic Consulting. People end up needing to pay us to hunt that kind of detail down because they haven't kept a good record throughout. So I think attention to detail is a really important part of writing a good lit review. Be over the top in terms of the information that you're recording. Chances are it will stand you in good stead later down the track. Now, I couldn't run a session on lit review tips without touching on reference management software. Reference management software, in case anyone isn't aware of what it is, allows you to generate in-text citations and also create a reference list at the end of your document. Just out of curiosity, I mentioned the raise hand button earlier today. Could I get you guys to raise your hand if you are using reference management software? If you can't find the raise hand button, send me a quick message via the question panel to let me know. So it might be that you're using EndNote or RefWorks, Mendeley or Zotero. Just pop your hand up quickly just to give me an indication. And remember, you can let me know via the question panel if you'd prefer. Okay, so it looks like probably about 80% of you are, which is really good to see. Those of you that perhaps aren't, might be worth reconsidering. Something I hear a lot of from academics and postgrad students is that they don't use reference management software because they've had bad experiences with it in the past. Would probably be worth finding out a little bit more about how to use it well, and also perhaps trying a different system. So if you've tried EndNote, perhaps try something like Zotero instead. Definitely worth a second look. Now, I know that a lot of people just use reference management software for creating their reference lists and formatting their in-text citations. What I'd like to make a point of today is to encourage you to use it beyond those functions. They're actually a really good organisational tool. So regardless of the reference management software you're using, there are fields that you can store the abstract, you can enter in keywords, and you can make notes on your reading. The beauty of having that information in software rather than handwritten notes is it means it's later searchable, and that makes it well worth its weight in gold. I mentioned earlier I like to record the quality of the articles that I read. I actually enter that into my reference management software as a keyword. Excellent, good, average, rubbish, whatever I'm using for that particular project. And that way, if I want to check all of the articles I've read that were particularly high quality, I can do a really simple search within my reference management software to locate it. I remember years ago when I worked at Auckland University, I was teaching a thesis writing workshop. And we were talking about how to organise references. And one of the students mentioned she had a system where she had different coloured boxes for the hard copies of her articles. So she had a red box, they were for the hot articles, the really good ones, a blue box for the cold ones, they were the bad ones, and a yellow box for the ones in between. And I always remember her saying that she felt so efficient filing her articles away into those boxes. But the problem was, if she wanted to locate something by the last name of the first author, everything was actually organised by how good the article was, so she had to go through all the boxes. I think that's where reference management software is really beneficial, because you can sort your information by author, by journal, anything else you want, and you can then search your keywords, notes, and abstracts to identify the articles that you need. So if you are already using them, or if you're considering using them, think of them more as organisational tools as opposed to just a way to cite references in your writing. Now, reference management software is something I could talk a lot about, and this is a more general session about Lit Review tips. But I do want to make one final point just before I mention what the options are available to you. Reference management software is only as good as the information that you enter. I think we get a bit careless. With recent advances in technology, we can have information automatically entered, and so we assume if it's come from a library database, for example, that it will therefore be correct. Whenever you're importing information into the application of your choice, you should always double check that it is right. They all have little quirks. Some of them put the year of publication into the journal field, or the author gets accidentally put into the abstract, and so on. So it's your job to make sure that the information is complete, that it's been entered correctly, and that you aren't missing anything. If you are missing something or something needs corrected, make sure that you do that at the time. That, I think, will be a really valuable strategy throughout the Lit Review process. You don't want to wait until the last minute to be finding missing detail. When you're at the final stages, chances are you're probably a bit stressed, might be a bit sleep deprived, so attention to detail is probably not going to be that great. So just have regular time slots throughout the writing process just to update and correct any reference information rather than waiting towards the end. Now, for those of you that are not currently using reference management software, here are some of the options that are available to you. So the four most common are EndNote, Mendeley, Zotero, and RefWorks. They all serve the purposes that I've just talked about. EndNote and RefWorks both need to be purchased, but your institution may have a license for them. Mendeley and Zotero are both free open source software. You do need to pay for storage if you exceed the free limits though. I personally think both Zotero and Mendeley are much better than EndNote and RefWorks. I personally use Zotero, but don't let that sway you. If you haven't started using one of them, have a look at the pluses and minuses before you jump in and find out what your institution recommends as well. Now I can see some questions coming in. I will just do this last slide, I think, and then I might quickly take a few of the questions. Just in terms of some other software that I would recommend, I'd very much recommend either Inspiration or Xmind, both of which are mind mapping applications. My preference is Inspiration, but you do need to pay for that. So I've included Xmind also, which I use occasionally and quite like, and I've included that because Xmind is free. Mapping out your Lit Review before you write can be enormously helpful, and mind maps are an excellent way to take notes on the articles that you read. Also got a couple of recommendations for online note-taking systems, both Evernote and OneNote. Now I personally use Evernote, so I'm going to use that as an example to explain what they do. Evernote's an online information storage tool. It's free for basic features and it's cloud-based, so that means you can access notes or other information across multiple devices or computers. Also allows for a range of different types of notes to be stored, so you can have free text notes, audio files, PDF, Word documents, and so on. So it's really flexible. I'm a massive fan of Evernote. Some of you may have heard me talking about it before, probably because I'm actually not very naturally organised. And one of the things I love about it is since I've started using it, I've never not been able to locate a piece of information that I need. So I certainly see a possible role for Evernote and OneNote in the Lit Review process. Just a word of warning though, if you are storing PDFs of journal articles in your reference management software, you probably don't also want to store them in Evernote, as you'll get unnecessary duplication. Lastly, no surprises because it's me presenting today, I've included QSR NVivo, which I think has huge potential for literature reviews. NVivo is actually qualitative data analysis software, but technically journal articles and other literature is text, and therefore NVivo can be used to analyse text-based information. Now, we actually have a training course coming up specifically on using NVivo for lit reviews. So if you are interested in the possibilities that NVivo has to offer, keep an eye out for that information at the end of my slides. Now, I think some of the questions that came in related to reference management software in NVivo, so I'm just going to take a moment to answer those. So one of the questions that came through, Suzanne has mentioned that she tends to use NVivo to record notes on articles and Zotero to actually store the citation. Would I suggest recording the notes in Zotero instead? I think it depends on personal preference. The key thing there is to make sure you have your notes in one or the other. I tend to put mine personally into Zotero, and if I need them, I bring them across into NVivo. And in terms of what I have in NVivo, it's usually the actual PDFs of journal articles and so on. But it does depend a little bit on the nature of the material I'm dealing with, and I think that's very much a personal preference. But what I really want to emphasize is that issue around if you have some notes in NVivo, you have some notes in Zotero, you're actually stuck between both systems and you're not making the best of either of them. Now, the other question that has come through, it takes a really long time to code and organize readings. Is it worth spending time recording details of your references in your lit review? I'm not sure if I fully understood that question actually, so do feel free to pop through a little bit more detail about it. I always think it's worth recording details. Partly because as I get older, my memory has gone on me somewhat. I think you've got to weigh that up depending on the project, the research that you're working with at the time. I think constantly reading articles and coding and organizing files is actually a really good procrastination technique. So if you are constantly doing that and not moving yourself forward, perhaps it's a little bit too much time. Otherwise, details about references are always a good reference point later down the track. I think as well, though, it depends on how much emphasis you're going to be placing on the article. And something I'm about to move into is deciding what you'll be including and excluding. So that might help answer that question a little bit. So if I haven't quite answered that, it looks like that question was from Suzanne. Do let me know, Suzanne, and I'm happy to clarify that more at the end. But my last set of tips around the manage step is managing your reading, because I know that that can be really challenging for people in terms of processing the huge volumes of information you get for a lit review. So I use something called SQ3R, which is a technique for active reading. It ensures that you're reading in a really focused manner and that you're extracting out just the information that you need. So in terms of a lit review, it's a very helpful strategy. Now, in terms of what it stands for survey, question, read, recite, and review. So let's back up a bit and just talk about survey. This step is a little bit like warming up before exercising. You're just taking a few minutes to warm your mind up to the content that you're about to engage with. Skim over the item, look for subheadings, keywords, anything in bold or italics, and you might also check the intro and the conclusion just for some key points. Once you've surveyed, the next step is question. And the idea here is that you generate specific questions that you want to get answers to when you actually do the reading. So that survey step should actually help you figure out what questions are relevant. But if you're stuck for questions, the good old standard who, what, why, how, where, and when type questions are always a good place to start. Next is the beginning of the 3 R's, which is read. That involves you doing the actual reading, taking notes, and trying to answer the questions that you generated. As I hinted at before, try not to get too sidetracked with details that aren't relevant to you. Once you've read, you recite back what you think the key points are, and when you've done that, you review to check that you've actually recalled the information correctly. Now, SQ3R isn't the only way to approach your reading, but I personally find it's a really good technique for staying engaged and being focused. And it should hopefully also help you avoid the experience when you get to the bottom of the page and you realize you have absolutely no idea what you've just been reading for the last 5 minutes. I'm sure many of you have had that experience yourselves. So if SQ3R sounds like something you'd like to know more about, just a quick Google search will kick up a lot of really helpful resources on it. It's a very well-known technique. But that was my last tip for the manage stage. Just before I move on to writing, I wanted to touch briefly on critique. I hinted earlier that a good lit review doesn't just summarise what other people have said. Needs to be really critical of previous research findings and place them in an appropriate context for your research question. Now, in terms of how you go about critiquing, I gave some suggestions earlier when I was talking about the quality of articles. So you'll obviously be looking at things like the research question, the study design, how they've gone about collecting data, analysing and interpreting it. But all of those things are a whole research methods course in themselves, so I'm not going to go into the details of all of those things, particularly as well, you're all from different disciplines today. So what I want to focus on for our webinar this morning is just a few techniques to help you with that critiquing process. And I've got a couple of note-taking systems that might just help prompt you with generating critiques. So the first one is a column system. And with this, you can actually have as many columns as you want. You can customize it to suit yourself. And you could just be taking notes on paper, or you might generate it in Microsoft Word. The example I've got on my slide has 3 columns, headings and main points, then the details of what's in the item, and you could also perhaps as part of that include some examples. And in the 3rd column are any personal responses. Because a big part of writing a lit review is critiquing and comparing, you can see there are actually examples of both of those in that final column. So just having that personal response column will hopefully encourage you to be a little bit more critical about what you've read and reflect on it as you're reading. Another example is a matrix system, which is pretty much like a spreadsheet, so you could do it in something like Excel. Matrix has rows and columns. Rows are for your documents, such as your journal articles, and the columns are for the topics that you want to summarize. The idea is it's a way of condensing down big volumes of information because you're forced to just write down pertinent points. Not a method I use myself, but I've read other people's descriptions of how they use it, and they often say it creates order out of chaos, which I must admit I really like the sound of. Now, in terms of what might be in those columns, some suggestions would be things like what the main research question of the study was, maybe some comments on their methodology. You might include things like sample size or how the sample was recruited. You could include key findings and maybe any contradictions in terms of do they agree or disagree with other authors. So once again, nothing earth-shattering here, just an example of a way of taking notes that will encourage you to be making those critiques as you go. Now, my last stage of the literature review process is doing the actual writing, which is probably the most important part because that's what other people see. It's probably one of the more challenging steps though, and I know it's something that people struggle with. So just got a few final slides around this step. Before we talk about the writing process though, I wanted to talk about the structure of a good lit review. So ideally your lit review will have what we call an upside down triangle structure. The idea is you start out with a very broad topic, and as your lit review progresses, you get more and more specific to the point where you are ready to present your research questions. A good lit review will mean that by the time the reader gets to the research questions, when they see them, they say, well, of course that's what the research question is. What else could it possibly be? Because everything else that led up to that point will be making it very, very clear what the gap in the literature is. To give you an example of that structure gone badly wrong, one of the very first things I learned as a postgrad student was how not to write a lit review. My master's thesis was on the friendships of children with ADHD, and I remember sending what I thought was the final draft of my literature review to my supervisor. I'd written quite a lengthy section on the friendships of children, and I had another quite long section on ADHD, how you diagnose it, what the characteristics are, and so on. And I very proudly presented that to my supervisor, who pretty much put a red pen through the lot of it. Now, I was understandably quite horrified, and I really clearly recall the feedback that he gave me. He said, "Lynn, it's really well written, but your research is actually about friendships of children with ADHD, and you have absolutely nothing on that particular topic." So I always think of that when I write lit reviews now. They have to be very focused and relate clearly to the research question. I have the research question on the wall above where I'm writing, just so that I can constantly refer back to it. It was a very hard lesson to learn as a master's student, but one that stayed with me, and I find it very helpful when I'm writing lit reviews now. Now, one of the things that's quite challenging with the lit review is actually getting started, because it's quite a big task and it can be a little bit overwhelming. So I've included some questions here to help you get started. They are just some initial questions that you might find useful when you're drafting, and you could do little documents up on each of those that may eventually end up in your final write-up, but the main purpose of them is just to get you started. So there's questions here such as what the purpose of the review is, how you will define key terms, and what you're going to include and not going to include, which I think is sometimes just as important. Other ideas here are things like major issues and debates, what the origins of the topic are, and so on. So I'm not going to read off all of those. They're really just a reference for you to take away after today. But hopefully you might find some of those useful in terms of getting underway with your own lit review. Now, a few other tips for you. I like to start with an outline, and as I mentioned earlier, I often create that outline as a mind map. I find having an outline just gives me a bit of a plan and gives me a feel for how many sections need written and whether or not I've got a logical structure to write to. Few things here to avoid. I have quite a pet hate of overquoting. If I'm reading a review and they have really extensive tracks of direct quotes from other people's work, it really makes me wonder why they haven't been able to put it in their own words. I think it's nice to include quotes from other authors, especially if you feel you genuinely can't put it better yourself, but consider just limiting the amount that you use. Your reader wants to know what you have to say, not what everyone else has to say on the topic. Unnecessary wordiness is another pet hate of mine. Be very careful about using more words than are necessary. It's something I'm very bad at when I write my teaching material, but luckily when it comes to my academic work, I'm the total opposite. My PhD was actually only 50,000 words, so it was nowhere near the usual 80 to 100,000 word PhD that's submitted. If you're concerned about wordiness, a couple of suggestions for you. First of all, it is possible to customize the grammar check in Microsoft Word, and that will identify wordiness for you. And another handy thing is to ask a colleague to help you identify it. Sometimes we can't pick it up in our own writing, but it's very easy for someone else to spot. And the last point on that bullet point there is repetition. And by that I just mean essentially using the same words over and over again. We all have pet words in our writing. I know for me it's however, there's other examples, moreover, furthermore. We constantly refer to the authors or the research. So it's just finding some ways to vary that up a little bit just so that it's not too annoying for the reader. Now, lit reviews are time consuming, so do ensure that you plan time for several drafts. Your first draft shouldn't be your final, and it will probably need to go through quite a few iterations before you do get it to that final stage. And make sure you are kind to your reader. Use signposts throughout. A good lit review tells a story, so guide the reader through that story as you're writing. Use linking words and phrases. So you might say things like, we've just been covering theory XYZ, which relates to theory ABC, which I'm going to be moving on to now. So you're constantly giving the reader a feel for the linkages there. And I've said this last point a few times, everything comes back to your research questions. So have that in front of you as you write, as I've just mentioned. Okay, well, the final content slide before we do the final few winding up slides. Be very wary when you're writing up about making a statement such as no studies exist, because it's going to be just your luck that the person who is reading your review will be aware of the one piece of research that exists. So be very careful about that. Lack of critique is another common error, which leads to what I call shopping list summaries. So this is basically where you're just saying Smith said XYZ, Jones said ABC, and there's no reflection on their work or critique. Poor structure or linking, I've talked about a little bit already. So you need to make sure that your lit review tells a story and that it makes a really clear argument as well. Remember, it is leading up to your research questions, so you need to make an argument throughout. You also want to make sure you don't go on too many side tangents outside that upside down triangle. And lastly, a really common mistake is poor referencing. There is nothing worse than reading about a really great study in a lit review. You want to get hold of it yourself, you flip to the reference list, and there's absolutely no sign of it there. So make sure you've been really particular about your referencing. Poor referencing is actually often a sign of other problems in the research. So it's something that we tend to leave to the last minute, but it is worth actually spending some time on. Now, I really only managed to scratch the surface this morning, so if you are still needing some further assistance with lit reviews, these are 3 books that I would very much recommend reading. Also, for those of you, I'll just flick through to this slide. For those of you who were interested in using NVivo for lit reviews, do keep in mind that we have a course coming up specifically on that. It's one of our online training courses on the 30th of November. Now, it is an intermediate level NVivo course, so it means that you do need to know the basics of NVivo, and it goes through a worked example. So you actually get an NVivo lit review project, and we work through how you might use it for that purpose. And of course, we have lots more training on offer, particularly our data analysis summer program that is starting next week, actually. But that is me through the main content. I am more than happy to take any final questions that you might have, but a few admin-y things before we do that. Firstly, when you do exit the session, and I'm aware it's coming up to 12, so if anyone does need to leave for their lunch or their next meeting, you're more than welcome to. But when you exit, a evaluation form will pop up. If you had a few minutes to complete that, that would be lovely. And also just to let you know, you will automatically get a copy of the recording in about an hour's time. It is sent via GoToWebinar, so if it doesn't arrive, it would probably pay to check your junk mail folder. But let's see if there are any final questions that you have. And while you guys are typing, I'll just talk very briefly about who we are and what we do. I don't like to waste time with that front up because I like to get cracking with content. But just while some of you may be typing any final questions, we're an Auckland-based company that provide research and training services. So I often joke that we can either teach you how to do the research yourself, or if you don't have the time or resources, we'll do the work for you. So what that means in practical terms is, for those of you that are students, we can help you out with some data analysis advice, teach you some software skills, and if you have something like a thesis, we have what I call our one-stop shop, which means we do the proofing, formatting, and reference checking. You still need to do the writing, but we can assist with the other aspects of your work, like checking the references in your lit review. If you're an academic or in a more corporate setting, we can provide advice for your project to help you get the work completed efficiently, or you can outsource as much or as little of your project as you need to us. So everything from data collection through to writing up the findings. So if you are interested in any of our other services, I have our website on the slide now. But let's see if we have got any final questions. Doesn't look like we have, actually. What I might do is just stay online for a few moments. It might be you have a question but are still typing. So I'll stop talking now and just stay online and type back questions to any, type back answers to any questions that may come in. So I'll finish off by just wishing you all the best for your lit reviews. I hope you have picked up a few tips as part of this morning's webinars, and I look forward to possibly seeing you in some of our other upcoming sessions. Have a lovely rest of Friday, everyone, and enjoy the weekend.